The main purpose of this video is to talk positively about why I think Patreon is a good thing, to really extol the virtues of Patreon with absolutely zero irony. The caveat there being, I think it's worthwhile to talk about when Patreon is used correctly and when it is used incorrectly. And you'll see why I use such seemingly objective sounding words. I think there is a right way and a wrong way to use Patreon as a creator. We're going to wrap that up in just a couple of minutes. Before we get into it, I think I will reply verbally to a few of the comments that's come into the video immediately prior to this one. One person wrote into me saying, quote, "I don't quite understand why an intermediary like Patreon has to exist. Person A likes the content that person B produces and wants to financially support them. Why does person C even need to be involved? Why does there need to be an intermediary?" So I think in this video, I'm going to give you an answer to that question. The level of trust you need to have, the level of commitment you need to have to just take money, put it in an envelope, and have it disappear into a black hole. To just take money, put it in an envelope, and send it to the Green Party or People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals and get nothing back. Get nothing back. No news, no update, no proof of what having money. That is a huge, huge, huge leap for people to make. And there are some causes that inspire that kind of commitment. I'd say an easy example would be Save the Whales, Save the Elephants, where you can go out and give a rousing speech and show a short documentary clip and say, hey, this is us helping to nurse this elephant back to health and providing some kind of habitat, some kind of enclosure for this elephant to live in. Donate your money now to help orphaned and injured elephants like this. Very moving, very emotionally evocative appeal for donations. Some people will step forward, take their money, put it in an envelope and send it to you, or if you just provide your banking details, they will send you a bank transfer and expect nothing in return. Now, you can guess, even from how I'm phrasing this, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't really think that's a positive side of human nature. I don't think that is a positive side of the charity industry. I think it's quite dangerous and really self-destructive for a lot of the people involved. And what Patreon offers you is a much more porous, transparent, meaningful, and interactive relationship between the donor and the person or project being funded. So even for something like a book project, if you say, okay, donate money, I'm going to write and illustrate this book and then publish it. The ability for the donors to stay in touch with you. You could put up a daily update or a weekly update. I upload a lot. So most of my Patreon subscribers, they're getting multiple messages per day on Patreon. I've just been a mass uploader really the whole last 5 years. Not worth getting into why. But maybe it's once a day or maybe it's once a week. Hearing from that person, you having the opportunity to talk to that person, say, okay, well, we just had a conversation with the illustrator. We're trying to get the illustrations ready for the book. We ran into this roadblock. This illustrator at first was really confident, but then when we started going into detail about the three-dimensional perspective we wanted for these illustrations, they seemed like they weren't confident doing it. We're going to talk to another illustrator. By the way, this is not a hypothetical example. I went through this exact process trying to get an illustrator lined up for a children's storybook I'd written. That's incomparably different from and incomparably better than the bad old days of just taking your money, putting it in an envelope, and sending it off to some political cause and then never hearing back. Now, if it's the example of publishing a storybook, how satisfied or dissatisfied would you be if you donate money and then 5 years later the storybook materializes? You'll probably be angry and disappointed, even if the book turned out great. Or what if it turns out not as you had hoped? Maybe the book is kind of mediocre. Like, well, I'd imagined it looking like Dr. Seuss, and instead, the approach these guys took is not what I was hoping for with this book. Well, if you have something like Patreon, and let's say the book project takes 5 years, everyone involved in supporting you is hearing about and interacting with you step by step as you go through these disappointments and setbacks. They're seeing you make the decisions, strategic and artistic and aesthetic. Maybe they're ethical decisions too. Like, oh, yeah. Well, at an earlier stage, he thought it would look like a Dr. Seuss book, but then this happened and this happened. He started working with a new artist, and it ended up having more of a Disney look. Let's say the book ends up with, but they will have felt involved and included, and at least they had the ability to complain. At least they had the ability to quit, even. Maybe they had the ability to ask for a refund. I don't know. This type of porous, interactive, transparent social media platform makes the whole culture of giving and receiving something much different than it ever was in the past. And I had the experience in the bad old days before the internet. The internet just barely existed, talking about maybe 1998. I remember in the bad old days how awful it was to even have to ask for donations for the Green Party of Canada. And I remember people asking me, and it's like, look, if I donate money to this political party, what's going to happen to the money? And what do I get? What's the reward? Okay, you can preach to me some abstract karmic notion of doing good in the world. I'm not interested in your philosophical abstract idea of karma. I want results. I want outcomes. I want accountability. I want transparency. And yeah, I want that kind of interaction. I want to feel like my donation matters and my opinion matters, my perspective matters. And even if things go wrong, I want to be there with you, seeing step by step what went wrong and why. So Patreon is a really powerful, really meaningful transformation of the donor-recipient relationship. I've already explained most of what I have to say when I now add the caveat, if it is used correctly. Now, when is it used incorrectly? Shout out to Henya Mania, who I have no respect for under this heading. I signed up and donated money to Henya of Henya Mania. She kind of bullied me into it. I said, okay, Henya, I'll sign up for your Patreon group. When I signed up for Henya Mania's Patreon, if you don't know who Henya Mania is, she used to be a vegan activist. Now she's like an international travel and lifestyle blogger who doesn't do vegan activism at all, but she used to be a vegan activist. I signed up for her Patreon, and I was looking at a blank screen. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No talking to the audience, no direction. And as an apology, you got this message saying, hey, now that you joined my Patreon, you can use this link and join my special secret Facebook group where I interact with Patreon supporters, like to compensate for the fact that she was aware that her Patreon was a desert. It was just empty. There was no effort put into it. So then I clicked on that link to Facebook. Same thing. Dead. Empty. It was a desert. It was a tundra. And there was nothing there. She had made no effort. So if you donated to her Patreon, you get nothing. Absolutely nothing. The people who support me on Patreon, they get all kinds of stuff, good, bad, or indifferent. I mean, just yesterday, we recorded a 24-minute video in response to one of my Patreon supporters asking me problems about her personal life. And we really sat down and took 24 minutes to answer this question. So sometimes it's just a personal, emotional question I get sent in. Sometimes it's a political question. I do a lot of in-depth quality interaction with my audience, and they also just get updates about what's going on in my life. Like for a couple of days, I didn't upload any videos. It was only a couple of days because I was busy flying to France, taking care of my daughter, and recovering from jet lag. So they get some sense of interaction ongoing all the time. So Patreon, in its format and what it provides, is a really, really positive thing. And guess what? That's implicitly admitted by these so-called free speech critics of Patreon, because what they say in their critique is that they want to do the same thing as Patreon. They want to compete with Patreon, or they want to replace Patreon. They just want to create a version of Patreon that reflects their political priorities. Good luck. You can try. You can have a right-wing Patreon. You can have a racist Patreon. It's already been done. I read there's a website called Hatreon with an H, so it's a pro-hate, pro-racist version of Patreon. But this is not really a criticism of the function of Patreon. It's a positive appreciation of the function of Patreon. It's just a complaint that they want a version of Patreon with a different political bias or with a different ideological agenda. They're not even criticizing the idea of Patreon having an ideological agenda. Okay. So another comment I was going to reply to, someone objected to my comparison of Patreon to a grocery store, where I said, look, grocery store has to make decisions. Are we going to have this politically offensive magazine for sale? Are we going to have pornography for sale? And a grocery store will make the decision not to carry pornography, even though they could earn money They could maybe make more money by having pornography on the store shelves because it makes the grocery store look bad. So someone wrote in disagreeing with this, which is reasonable. You can have your own opinion. And he says, no, Patreon is only a payment processing service. So it is not reasonable to compare them to a grocery store. This is more like a bank shutting down a pornography store on the other side of town or something. It's not comparable to a grocery store refusing to carry porn. Now, this was my reply. I said, no. Patreon is a shop owned and managed by individual people, just the same as the grocery store in this respect. And they decide selling this product makes our shop look bad or makes us seem disreputable as management. Therefore, we won't allow it on the store shelves, despite the fact that it would earn us money. They're making an ethical decision as well as a PR decision, as well as a public relations decision or public perception decision. They are making an ethical decision. Patreon lost money by kicking out Sargon. They did it because they think it's the right thing to do. And that's something to remember. They make more money from one guy like Sargon than 1,000 people like me. I think they make more money from Sargon than 10,000 small people like me. Right? But Patreon plays a really positive role in my life, and it's really changed the way donor-driven politics and filmmaking and content creation works. And if you think Patreon is so bad, ask yourself this question. Why did YouTube themselves utterly fail to play this role that Patreon has played? Why isn't Google Corporation playing this role? Why didn't some other entity rise up to play this role? In a limited way, Kickstarter did, for sure. Patreon has competition from Kickstarter. I could fund a book project illustrating a storybook through Kickstarter. That is true. But Patreon, again, for those who are willing to make the commitment of time and a kind of accountability, just having this kind of interaction with their audience, Patreon is a tremendously positive step forward compared to being with the Republican Party and asking for donations, or being with the Green Party and asking for donations, or being with the Communist Party and asking for donations. Believe me, both of my parents donated money to the Communist Party. This is a segue to the next little Q&A thing I'm going to do here. Donating money and getting nothing back. You have no sense of where the money went, or even if you're just donating money to pay for someone's lifestyle so that they can afford rent and food and to live. It's their salary, where you have no feeling of where that money is going. So the old days of political campaign finance were really incredibly bleak hustle compared to what we're now capable of doing by Patreon. And this stuff, it's all politics, baby. It is all just as political as running for mayor. I'm not talking about purely artistic projects on Patreon. There are people who are just painting beautiful pictures. They just want you to donate to paint a picture. It's not what we're talking about here. This is all political. Sargon of Akkad is political. Jordan Peterson's political. Me and my channel, and you'll see even more in the year ahead, what I'm doing is political. These are political donations, and there's no doubt that Patreon is a kind of political grocery store. It's only comparable to a grocery store in one respect, because the groceries on the shelves that they're selling really are political change. So I got a comment from someone using the name Raiden or Raiden. He comments, the problem I see is blatant bias against conservative ideas. I think these platforms are exhibiting cowardice by caving in to the disproportionately vocal social justice warriors. When you boycott them, you're showing the SJW, social justice warriors, you're showing that they are not representative of the real world. Okay? So I disagree with this, as you can guess. What I say in reply is, the principle being tested here is simply a ban on 1, hate speech, and 2, abuse and bullying. Those are the two principles here being tested in terms of service, right? You, the guy I'm disagreeing with here, Raiden, you are implicitly admitting that conservative ideology requires or entails hate speech and bullying as defined, strictly speaking, by Patreon policy. Whereas non-conservative ideals do not cross these lines. Think about it. Think about what you're saying. This dispute is about people like Sargon of Akkad being guilty of hate speech and this other category. It gets less vague when you read the fine print of being abusive and bullying towards other people on the internet. Why do conservatives need that? Why are you saying this is biased against conservatives? It's because of the real content of your ideology and the real form of social and political change you're pursuing, which is hateful and vile and abusive. Now, here's the kicker. Please note, I'm reading my reply here, please note that I am an anti-communist, and I'm a very vocal, trenchant critic of communism, past and present. But you have to admit, communists on Patreon do not seem to have these problems. This is something interesting for you to face up to. So I did a quick Google search, and I was able to find examples. There's one called The Communist Current. I'm sure I would find it totally morally despicable in the same way that I find neo-Nazis morally despicable. Communists come on the internet and make excuses for mass murder. They justify Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong and Lenin and the massacres those people committed. They present an economic ideology that I also find immoral, so on and so forth. But there's nevertheless something interesting here. It is possible for communist extremists to come on Patreon and behave themselves within the limits of these terms of service, the form of censorship that Patreon imposes on you, the standards and practices that are required to have your product on the shelf of this grocery store. There are communists who are able to do that. But for some reason, you conservatives really have a problem conforming to a rule against hate speech and a separate rule against abuse and bullying. Why is that? Why is it possible for people to use this platform to preach the ideology of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, which I despise, I totally reject and disagree with? Why is it that they can make their case within these rules and you can't make yours? There's something for you guys, including Sargon of Akkad, to look in the mirror and face up to.